Um, as Olivia explained, I'll speak about recovery and BPD today. To get us going, a few objectives to get started with. I'm hoping that we can understand recovery as it's been defined from different perspectives. So recovery is, in a sense, a contested concept. There's not a single take on what recovery actually means. So I'll look at particularly at lived and living experience perspectives, and also touch on how recovery has been used in research, how it's been defined in research. Then we'll look at understanding that remission and recovery are very possible for BPD. They certainly are. We see that at Spectrum, and I see that in my clinical work. And the data actually confirms that recovery is very, very possible. Then we'll look at ways that clinicians might talk about recovery and support recovery in practice at the end. Okay, so I've got a definition here, which I won't read out aloud. You can read the definition. I'll speak to the context of the definition. So it's actually quite an old definition in a sense, but it's very widely recognised as a really important way of understanding what recovery is. It's from a living experience perspective. And research definitions, as we'll notice as we come along, as we proceed today, are very different. What I want to really emphasise in this definition is that it's deeply personal, very individual. What recovery looks like for one person will be radically different to somebody else. And it's also a process. So it's often referred to as a journey or a process within lived experience definitions of recovery. There's an emphasis on meaning, satisfying life, hope, those sorts of things. So that's one definition of recovery that's pretty widely used. I think the other thing to say at this point is, I won't touch on this much, but there is also a framework for recovery called the CHIME framework. I don't know that we're going to have a lot of time to get into that in detail today, but if you're interested in looking into recovery more fully, then CHIME, CHIME, which stands for connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment, I believe, if my memory is serving me well. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to really focus on those process models of recovery, like the William Anthony definition that's up there at the moment. Okay, then what I wanted to do next is have a bit of a look at some of the work that we did here at Spectrum in 2017. This was a qualitative project with about 17 people with lived experience of BPD, and I think about roughly 17 clinicians. I think there was roughly equal numbers. And we looked at what recovery means to people with a lived experience and clinicians. And then we also looked at what the conditions for recovery were from different perspectives. So from a lived experience perspective, one thing that came through really strongly in, I think, 9 out of the 17 interviews actually, was that recovery is not a cure necessarily. It doesn't mean being cured. It's a process. It's a different way of perhaps responding to things in your life, but it's not a cure. And that positive change is possible but risky. And I think that's quite an interesting finding in a sense. So people spoke about how they weren't always entirely confident that they could recover, so it seemed kind of risky to hope for recovery. And they also spoke, some of my participants in that study spoke about how they'd always had a mental illness. So who would I be, or what would life be like if I were to recover? You know, what does that actually mean for me? So that was another theme that came through quite strongly. Then the conditions for change, I think, from a lived experience perspective, were really interesting. Acceptance of the need for change, curiosity about oneself, and I'm part of the MBT team, so we love curiosity about ourselves. You know, that came through quite strongly. Reflection on one's own behaviour. And again, I think it's interesting that from a lived experience perspective, that reflection was something that was emphasised in the data. Then working on past trauma and not blaming oneself. So they were the conditions for recovery or for change, positive change, that the lived experience participants in that study came up with or spoke to. Then just to emphasise that different people have different senses of what recovery is, let's have a look at what the clinicians had to say about what they felt recovery was. So there were 3 ways that clinicians thought about recovery, and they're not necessarily all that compatible or similar even, they're quite different. One was that recovery is a complex individual process of moving towards a satisfying life. So we've come across that kind of take on recovery already this morning. Different ways of relating to oneself, and also symptom relief and improved psychosocial functioning, which I think is closer to more of a state definition or a research definition of recovery than a process definition. But what I want to emphasise here is that different people have different takes on what recovery is, and even the clinicians, there was not a clear single definition of what recovery was. Recovery, clinician perspectives on clinicians of change were cultivating curiosity about oneself. So there was that echo of the findings from the consumer or the lived experience data. Fostering agency, and recovery is a creative process. So I'll come back to the notion of creativity in recovery when I talk to how clinicians might support recovery. And I think there's an echo in a way for me, excuse me, between the definition that I used at the start, the William Anthony definition, and the notion of creativity. Very individual, unique process, and he doesn't use the word creative, but there's echoes there again, I think, of individuality and uniqueness to the individual. Then this is some data from quite a while back as well, 2010, and it took me a while to make the graph yesterday, so please appreciate the graph. But what I want to emphasise here is how possible, particularly in remission of symptoms, is for BPD. So the blue line, I believe, is sustained remission. So that means remission without losing remission over the 10-year period or the 8-year period or so on. The yellow is remission, so that means that people were at remission at that time point, but that they had remitted at some point prior to that. And then the red is recovery. So as you can see, it might be a bit hard to read the numbers, but I believe the number for remission after 10 years is 86%, which I think is actually pretty impressive, really, as something that is very possible for people. Recovery on the graph looks perhaps less possible or less likely. It's hovering around the 50% figure at 10 years. The thing there is that this is a research study, so recovery was operationalised in a very particular way, and that was remission plus in full-time study or employment, and one meaningful relationship with somebody other than a first-degree relative. So that's a reasonably, I think, stringent definition of recovery. It's also, just to contrast with the more living experience definition, it's kind of a state or I'll call it a state definition, that you must achieve certain things to be said to be in recovery. And I understand why in research processes they need to operationalise it, but there's 2 points there. It is quite a stringent definition, and also that it does contrast with the more process stuff that I've been speaking to already. So we'll move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about was how you might support or talk about recovery by emphasising process in clinical practice. I've really emphasised that it's a process and it's a highly creative one. That's what I see from my clinical practice, and that's also was borne out in the research that we did here in 2017, that both people with lived or living experience and the consumers emphasised that it was a creative process. So I talk about, in that sense, being open to possibilities. And I think it's actually a reasonably difficult thing to explain abstractly to somebody what recovery might be about. And my best sort of attempt at speaking to what recovery is with clients here at Spectrum is to encourage them to be open to possibilities. Or the other way that I put it is to use your antenna to be alert to possibilities. So I sort of go, let's just think about what's out there, what's possible for you, what might, just be a first step towards changing things a bit. That's the sort of languages I use around when I speak to recovery. I would also speak about it being a process, not an end stage, not a cure, that sort of thing. I avoid direct suggestions. So I would really avoid saying something like, oh, you could join a choir. Now, that might be something that might be fabulous for a particular person to do. But I think that undercuts the sort of creative individual agency side of recovery. That for me, I prefer to talk about how you might get there, what the process might be, where you might start, how that would feel. It might feel very, very daunting, or it might feel natural. Often it does seem actually quite daunting to start to put the feelers out and start to look at things that are going to improve your life and what might need to be different. So those differences might be things that need to be different psychologically for the individual, or there might be practical things that are getting in the way, that sort of thing. So what I find is it's very, very different, the answers I get from different people. Some people talk about maybe starting with the local library and seeing what's on there and, what they can find in their local library or other community venues. Other people talk about Facebook or social media, things that have come up there that they're interested in. Talking to friends and relatives about what, who I am and what might be good for me. They're the sort of starting points that I typically hear from people here at Spectrum. Okay, so I'll just move to the final slide now. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but hopefully okay. Yep, giving the thumbs up. Okay. So the final slide here is talking about recovery goals and recovery stars. Now, I would assume that in many of your organisations, you do need to have a treatment plan and there's going to be recovery goals on that treatment plan. In my experience, it's important to avoid really concrete goals like I will be in a relationship. That's a state definition of recovery. I'm going to get to this state and there's going to be something that is sort of measurable in a sense. And it doesn't really emphasise process. So I'd start to talk about a person who talks about wanting to be in a relationship, more about what they might need to do, how they might need to change, attitudes, practical things, where they would start with being more open to meeting new people, let's say, rather than recording I will be in a relationship as a recovery goal, because it's a little too concrete for my liking. Then I think it's also important to explore what that would mean and how the person might make some small first steps and then build on those steps. So I've sort of spoken to that in a way. And I think that it's important to emphasise small steps, nothing too huge, like, completely change careers or something that might be a fine recovery goal in many senses, but let's break it down into more smaller first steps. Then I've got there an example of a recovery star. I'm not an expert on recovery stars, and I did have a look at trying to find empirical support or theoretical support for the recovery star model, and didn't get too far. Time intervened, and I didn't get too far with that. But again, the thing that concerns me a little bit about Recovery Stars is it's very preset in terms of which domains people look at. So there's a work domain, there's a self-care domain. I can't actually read the writing on the star very well at the moment, but some people might not, part of their recovery process or journey might not be around self-care. That might be not something that's particularly on their agenda, or that they need or want to kind of think about. So I'm a little bit, there's no reason why you can't use a visual or a diagram to illustrate what recovery might look like. But it does concern me a little bit if there's too many presets around where people, what those particular ambitions might be around recovery.